Join me as I dive into these 3 creepy hotel horror stories and see if I can uncover whether they're real or just myths. I'm sure we've all heard them, creepy hotel horror stories that send shivers down our spines and make us think twice about booking that weekend getaway. But have you ever stopped to think, are these tales really true? Or are they just the product of overactive imaginations and a desire for a good scare? Today, we're going to examine 3 specific hotel horror stories and dig deep to see if we can uncover the truth behind them. From the Stanley Hotel in Colorado to the Hotel del Coronado in California, there's no shortage of hotels with dark pasts and spooky reputations. But what is it about these stories that captivate us so? Is it the thrill of fear, the rush of adrenaline when we're safely tucked away in our own beds? Or is it something deeper, a desire to understand the unknown and the unexplained? I think it's a little bit of both. On one hand, there's no denying the thrill of a good scare, the goosebumps that rise when we're listening to a spooky tale around a campfire. But on the other hand, I think we're also driven by a desire to understand the truth, to separate fact from fiction, and get to the bottom of these creepy legends. Of course, not everyone believes in ghosts or the supernatural. Many of us approach these stories with a healthy dose of skepticism, wondering if they're just the product of overactive imaginations or clever marketing tactics. But even the most ardent skeptics among us can't deny the allure of a good ghost story. So let's dive in and explore these 3 hotel horror stories. Are they real or just myths? Let's find out. Story 1. A night spent in the haunted La Posada Hotel in Santa Fe. I never believed in ghosts until I spent a night at La Posada Hotel in Santa Fe. As a travel journalist, I've stayed in my fair share of haunted hotels, but I always approached such claims with healthy skepticism. That changed on a crisp October evening in 2019. The hotel, originally the Staub House, still maintains its 19th century grandeur. As I checked in, I couldn't help but admire the Victorian architecture and period furnishings. The clerk, an older woman named Maria, handed me my key with a knowing smile. "Room 256, she said. "That's on Julia's floor." I knew the story, of course. Julia Staub, the wife of wealthy merchant Abraham Staub, had lived here in the 1800s. After losing her 8th child in infancy, she had fallen into a deep depression, rarely leaving her room. She died in 1896 at the age of 52, her death a subject of much speculation. Some whispered about murder, others about suicide. The only certainty was that she died in her bedroom, now room 256. The sun had already set when I made my way up the creaking wooden staircase. The second-floor corridor was dimly lit by wall sconces that cast long shadows across the patterned wallpaper. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet, but each step seemed to echo in the stillness. As I approached my room, a cold spot hit me like walking into a wall of ice. In New Mexico's desert climate, such sudden temperature drops are unusual. I fumbled with the key, my fingers suddenly clumsy with cold. The room was beautiful, decorated in period-appropriate Victorian style with a 4-poster bed and antique furnishings. A large mirror dominated one wall, its gilded frame catching the warm light from the bedside lamps. I set up my laptop to work on my article, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Around midnight, I heard it, the soft sound of a woman humming. It seemed to come from the hallway, a melancholic German lullaby that grew louder, then fainter, as if someone was pacing back and forth. Julia had been German, I remembered. I opened my door to look, but the hallway was empty. The humming stopped. Back in my room, I noticed the temperature had dropped again. My breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. The mirror had fogged over, despite the room's dryness. As I watched, horrified, a finger seemed to draw itself across the clouded glass, forming letters, "Mein Kind." My German was rusty, but I knew what it meant, my child. The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I felt a presence in the room. When the light stabilized, I saw her in the mirror, a tall woman in a black dress, her face pale but beautiful, with dark eyes full of infinite sadness. She stood behind me, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. My heart pounding, I turned back to the mirror. She was still there, her reflection growing clearer. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. The temperature plummeted further, and I could see frost forming on the window panes. Then came the sound of a baby crying, distant but clear, followed by the rustle of skirts against carpet. The crying grew louder, more desperate. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, and Julia's image reached out, her face contorted with maternal anguish. I'd interviewed the hotel staff earlier that day. They'd told me about guests hearing phantom footsteps, about objects moving on their own, about the piano in the downstairs parlor playing itself. But nothing had prepared me for this. The crying stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, I heard Julia's voice, clear as day. "See Lassen, Michigan, Nick Zuim. They won't let me reach him." The mirror cracked with a sound like a gunshot, a single line running diagonal across its surface. The ghostly image fractured, and Julia's face split into a dozen broken reflections, each showing a different expression of grief and despair. I spent the rest of the night huddled in an armchair, watching as the room's temperature fluctuated wildly. Objects would move slightly, a hairbrush sliding across the dresser, the curtains swaying without a breeze. The humming would start and stop, sometimes accompanied by the sound of soft weeping. As dawn approached, the phenomena gradually subsided. The room slowly warmed, and the oppressive feeling of being watched lifted. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, I finally dared to approach the mirror again. The crack was still there, but Julia's image was gone. At checkout, Maria didn't seem surprised by my haggard appearance. "Julia visits sometimes," she said simply. "She's not harmful, just lost. Still searching for her baby after all these years." The story has been reported many times over the years, with countless witnesses describing similar experiences. The hotel's guest books are filled with accounts of encounters with Julia's spirit. Some tell of seeing her in period dress, gliding down the hallways. Others describe inexplicable cold spots, mysterious sounds, and items being moved by unseen hands. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their consistency. The details match across decades of reports: the German lullaby, the temperature drops, the mirror phenomena. Hotel staff have documented countless unexplained events, from lights turning on and off to full apparitions of Julia in her black dress. Scientists and paranormal investigators have conducted numerous studies at La Posada, recording electromagnetic fluctuations and temperature anomalies that defy explanation. But perhaps the most convincing evidence is the sheer number of rational, skeptical people who, like myself, have had their worldview shattered by a night in room 256. I still have the photograph I took of the cracked mirror, and sometimes, when I look at it closely, I swear I can see a faint reflection of a woman's face in the fractured glass, still searching, still mourning, still trapped in her endless vigil for the child she lost so long ago. Story 2. The Queen Mary luxury liner with a reputation for being haunted. I told myself I wasn't superstitious when I booked my stay on the Queen Mary. As a maritime historian, I was more interested in the ship's storied past as a luxury liner and World War II troopship than its reputation for being haunted. But what happened during my 3-night stay made me question everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. The first thing that struck me was how the ship's immense hull blocked out the California sun, casting a permanent shadow over the boarding area. Even in the bright Long Beach afternoon, there was something foreboding about the way the black and white smokestacks loomed against the sky. The ship hadn't moved in decades, yet it seemed alive somehow, watching. My cabin was on B deck, not far from the infamous first-class swimming pool. I'd read about it, of course, the place where young Jackie had reportedly drowned in the 1940s. As I wheeled my suitcase down the narrow corridor, the metal walls seemed to amplify every sound. The creak of old wood, the groan of settling steel, the distant echo of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but authentically preserved. The porthole window offered a slice view of the harbor, and the vintage furnishings made it easy to imagine the ship in its heyday. I spent that first afternoon exploring, taking notes for my research. Everything was fine until I reached the pool. The indoor pool area was deserted, which wasn't unusual. It had been drained and closed to the public years ago. But as I stood at the edge, looking down into the deep end, I heard it, the sound of splashing water. I whirled around, but the pool was still empty, its tiled bottom visible in the dim light filtering through the portholes. Then came the giggling, high-pitched, childlike, echoing off the walls. "Hello!" I called out, my voice bouncing back at me. The giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of wet footprints padding across the tile floor. But there were no footprints, no water, no child. I hurried back to my cabin, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks with the ship's acoustics. That evening, I worked on my laptop, documenting my observations. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock at my door. Thinking it might be another guest who'd lost their way in the confusing corridors, I opened it. The hallway was empty, but the air was suddenly, inexplicably cold. As I went to close the door, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. A set of small, wet footprints leading away from my door and disappearing around the corner. I slammed the door shut and double-checked the lock. My heart was racing, and my academic skepticism was starting to crack. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down, I was starting to believe the stories. Sleep came fitfully that night. I kept waking to the sound of a child's laughter, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it seemed to be right beside my bed. Once, I jolted awake to find my porthole window fogged over from the inside, despite the warm night. Written in the condensation were the words, "Wanna play?" The second day, I tried to focus on my research, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the ship's museum section, I found a photograph from 1945 that made my hands shake. A group of passengers by the pool, and in the background, a little girl in a blue bathing suit. According to the caption, the photo was taken 2 days after the documented drowning. That night, I was awakened by the sound of running water. My bathroom sink was on full blast, the mirror completely fogged. As I reached to turn it off, I heard a splash from the bathtub behind me. In the mirror's reflection, I could see a little girl sitting in the tub, her dark hair plastered to her face, her blue bathing suit dripping. When I spun around, the tub was empty and dry, but the worst was yet to come. On my final night, I woke to the feeling of something cold and wet touching my hand. Opening my eyes, I saw her standing beside my bed, a pale figure in a soaking wet bathing suit, water pooling impossibly around her feet on the carpet. Her eyes were dark hollows, her skin had a bluish tinge, and her hair drifted around her face as if she were underwater. "Will you play with me?" she asked, her voice gurgling like she was speaking through water. "Everyone else is too scared to play." I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She reached for my hand again, her small fingers icy cold and dripping. "The pool is always open at night," she said, her face splitting into a terrible smile that revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart thundering in my chest. When I opened them again, she was gone, but my hand was wet, and there was a small puddle of water on the floor beside my bed. I spent the rest of the night in the lobby, surrounded by other people. When dawn came, I checked out early, my hands shaking so badly I could barely sign the paperwork. The desk clerk didn't seem surprised. "You stayed on B deck, didn't you?" she asked knowingly. "Near the pool." I nodded, and she sighed. "Jackie gets lonely," she said simply. "She just wants someone to play with. But people don't understand that she doesn't know her own strength anymore, or that she's still underwater in her mind." I later learned that several guests had reported being pulled by unseen hands while swimming in the pool, back when it was still open. Others described encountering a dripping, wet little girl in the corridors, always at night, always asking them to play. Some even claimed to have been followed back to their cabins by the sound of wet footsteps and children's laughter. I'm writing this from my home office, hundreds of miles from the Queen Mary. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the echo of that gurgling giggle. And when I wake up, my hands are inexplicably damp, as if someone with wet, small fingers had been holding them while I slept. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it all. The ghostly encounters, the impossible puddles, the haunting sound of phantoms splashing in an empty pool. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. And I know that somewhere on that grand old ship, in the depths of night, a lonely little girl in a blue bathing suit is still looking for someone to play with. Just don't say yes if she asks you. Some games, once started, can never be finished. Story 3. Ghosts at the Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables, Florida. I came to the Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables to write about its architecture. As a historian specializing in 1920s design, I was drawn to its Mediterranean revival style, its soaring tower, and its storied past. I never expected to write about its ghosts instead. The hotel rises like a Spanish castle against the Florida sky, its iconic tower visible for miles. Built in 1926 by George Merrick, it stands as a testament to the dreams of Coral Gables' founder. Dreams that, like Merrick himself, met a tragic end. But I didn't know just how tragic until that sultry Miami night in August. The lobby still breathes old money, with its hand-painted ceiling, travertine floors, and marble columns. As I checked in, the late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The clerk, an elderly gentleman named Vicente, handed me a brass key rather than the usual key card. "Room 1126, he said, "in the tower, Mr. Merrick's favorite section of the hotel." The elevator ride to the 11th floor was surprisingly smooth for such an old building. But as I ascended, the temperature seemed to drop with each floor, despite Miami's notorious heat. By the time I reached my floor, I could see my breath in the air. My room was magnificent, with arched windows overlooking the golf course where the hotel's famous pool once stood. The furniture was period appropriate, a massive mahogany bed, a writing desk that looked original to the building, and a full-length mirror in a gilded frame. But something felt off. The air had a heaviness to it, like the pressure before a storm. That first evening, I worked at the desk, researching the hotel's history. Merrick had poured his soul into this place, creating a palace of luxury that attracted royalty, movie stars, and gangsters alike. But the crash of 1929 destroyed him. He lost everything, and while official records say he died of natural causes in 1942, rumors of suicide or murder have persisted for decades. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the corridor, measured, deliberate steps that stopped outside my door. Then came the sound of papers shuffling, like someone reviewing documents. I opened the door but found only an empty hallway, though the scent of Cuban cigars lingered in the air. Merrick, I remembered, had been known for his custom-rolled cigars. Back in my room, I noticed the desk chair had moved, swiveled to face the window as if someone had just stood up from it. My research notes had been rearranged, stacked neatly in a way I hadn't left them. And there, on top of the pile, was a sketch of the hotel's tower that I definitely hadn't drawn. The temperature plummeted again. The mirror began to fog over, despite the bone-dry air conditioning. In its clouded surface, I saw a figure form. A tall man in a 1920s suit, his face stern but dignified. He was holding what looked like architectural plans, studying them with intense concentration. My hands shaking, I reached for my camera. The click of the shutter seemed to disturb him. He looked up directly at me, his eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. The mirror cracked suddenly, a spiderweb pattern emanating from where his heart would be. Then came the voice, deep, resonant, filled with both authority and despair. It wasn't supposed to end this way. The lights flickered, and in that strobing darkness, I saw him materialize fully in the room. George Merrick, looking exactly as he did in photos from the hotel's opening day, but with an otherworldly pallor to his skin. He moved to the window, gesturing at the city beyond. "My city," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My beautiful city. They took it all away." The window rattled in its frame, and outside, the palm trees began to bend in a wind that shouldn't have existed 11 stories up. He turned to me, and in his eyes, I saw the weight of lost dreams, of a vision corrupted by greed and circumstance. "They say I died of natural causes," he said, his form flickering like a bad television signal. "Nothing natural about betrayal." The room's electrical system went haywire, lights blazing, then dimming, the television turning itself on and off, the air conditioning roaring like a jet engine. Papers flew from my desk, swirling in an impossible indoor tornado. In the chaos, I saw other shapes form. Figures in 1920s clothing, dancing to unheard music, their forms transparent but growing more solid with each passing second. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The papers drifted to the floor, and the temperature began to rise. But Merrick remained, standing by the window, looking out at his city with infinite sadness. "They demolished my dreams," he said softly. "But they couldn't destroy this." He gestured to the hotel around us. "This remains. This remembers." He turned to me one last time, straightened his spectral tie, and nodded formally. "Ensure they remember it correctly," he said, and then faded away like morning mist, leaving only the lingering scent of Cuban cigars. I spent the rest of the night documenting everything I'd seen. In the days that followed, I discovered I wasn't alone in my experience. Hotel staff shared stories of similar encounters. The phantom footsteps, the mysterious cigar smoke, the architectural drawings that appeared and disappeared in locked rooms. The hotel's archives contained dozens of witness accounts. Guests waking to find their rooms rearranged to match the original 1926 layout. Maintenance workers being guided to hidden structural problems by a tall figure in a vintage suit. People hearing heated conversations in empty rooms, always about property values and development plans. Vicente, the elderly clerk, wasn't surprised by my story. "Mr. Merrick still watches over his hotel," he told me. "He's proud of it, you see. It's the one piece of his dream that survived." I changed my article's focus from architecture to history. The true history of George Merrick and his grand vision for Coral Gables. Some might question my decision to include the supernatural elements, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I review my notes late at night, I catch a whiff of Cuban cigars, and my papers once again arranged themselves into perfect stacks. In the end, perhaps that's what ghosts really are. Not just spirits of the dead, but guardians of truth, ensuring that their stories are told correctly. And in the Biltmore's Tower, George Merrick still walks, protecting his legacy, one spectral appearance at a time. Just don't be surprised if you find your room rearranged during your stay. Mr. Merrick always was a perfectionist, and death, it seems, hasn't changed that one bit. So what do you think, guys? Are these creepy hotel horror stories real, or just myths? After examining the evidence and digging deep into the history behind each tale, I think it's clear that there's more to these stories than meets the eye. However, the real story, based on fact, is the first story, La Posada Hotel in Santa Fe. The other two stories we made up ourselves in an effort to trick and deceive you. And I think we probably did. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying the power of a good scare. And these 3 hotel horror stories have definitely left me sleeping with the lights on tonight. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more content on haunted places and urban legends. Have you ever experienced anything similar to these creepy hotel horror stories? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going.